Community and safety at GitHub is no different than trust and safety on any other online platform. We're responsible for things like spam, for abuse, but for harassment. I like to think that we take a little bit of a different approach in that we see our mission is kind of bifurcated into the positive and the negative. On the positive side, we're responsible for empowering maintainers to grow healthy and safe and inclusive and, most importantly, productive communities around their projects and around their code. And then on the negative side, we want to make sure that that any user that wants to can participate in the open source community on GitHub without being forced to risk their privacy or their personal safety in order to do so. And when we think about that, we think of it through a lens of encouraging good online citizenship. And underlying all this is a philosophy that online communities are offline communities. They just happen to be online. The same kind of particle physics apply. If you think of an offline community that in your hometown, maybe a religious institution, a bowling league, something like that, they're going to all have some common elements. They'll have a common challenge. It could be worship. It could be trying to win the game if it's a bowling league. They'll have leaders, right? It could be clergy or a team captain. And they'll have community norms. It could be holidays or league rules, right? If you cross the line, it's a foul. Same exact thing applies, bless you. Same exact thing applies to open source communities as well, right? We have a shared challenge. That's the project. That's the thing we're trying to solve. You have leaders. Those are maintainers. And you have community norms, which I'll get into more detail in a moment. When we first started going into this space through GitHub from a product perspective, we thought about it in terms of bad actors. We even had a nickname for them in our design thinking. They were a dedicated persona. We called them jerk faces. That was kind of just a tongue-in-cheek term to encapsulate the trolls, the harassers, the people that are posting spam within communities that are disrupting the community and preventing them from being productive and collaborating around code. But as we did this, we realized that framing them in such a way, we weren't being empathetic to them. We were otherizing them, we were villainizing them, and that didn't give them an opportunity to really see them as for who they were, right? We're just writing them off. This is a bad person. This is a bad actor. It was a term that we took from the security community, but realized it didn't really apply as much in the open source community. So we reframed things. Instead of focusing on bad actors, we started focusing on disruptive behavior. And that created a model where we thought about pushing users from disruptive, right? The whole point of GitHub is to collaborate on code, right? And so anything that gets in the way of the community's ability to collaborate, that disrupts the community's ability to collaborate, is a disruptive behavior. They're not necessarily a good or bad person or a good or bad actor. They're a neutral actor, but they could at any given moment in time be exhibiting disruptive behavior or constructive behavior. Taking that a step further, we realized we're never going to get every user to not exhibit disruptive behavior at any given time. So if we did this, on average, the community would be someplace in the middle, but probably towards the left side of the middle to be an average disruptive community. So we took that one step further and started introducing the concept of inclusive behavior. Right? So what we want to do is we want to take the users and push them from disruptive behavior to constructive behavior, which is the new kind of baseline in our mind for acceptable behavior on the platform. And then once they're in that exhibiting constructive behavior, to push them further to act proactively, be welcoming, to create safe spaces within their communities to make those projects more inclusive. And so the way we implement that on GitHub is we think of GitHub as a federation of communities, not too dissimilar from Reddit and some other online platforms in which each community is semi-independent, a federation of communities. So in terms of what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior on our platform, the bare minimum baseline comes from our terms of service. That's don't do illegal things, essentially. Beyond that, about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, we came out with community guidelines, which layers above not just this is illegal, but a step further of this is the kind of behavior we want to see on our platform. Things like don't be a bully, don't harass others, don't dox others. And it creates just a slightly higher standard for what's acceptable behavior site-wide. And then even further layered on top of that are project norms. Those are the READMEs, the contributing files, the codes of conduct that each community, either on the repository level or on the organization level, adopts to control how their community is governed. And the way we think about that is a baseline of user expectations, which says these are the things that you are required to do if you want to be a user of GitHub. Don't do anything illegal. Don't be a bully. essentially that. And then the majority of the community norms actually come from community expectations. These are the expectations for you to participate in the Rails community, in the Node community, whatever community it might be that's set by the community. So they can still be a user on the platform, but maybe you have some control to kick them in or out of your community, or at least control their behavior within your community. So thinking about things through this lens, in the past year, and there's a little bit asterisk in the record book because of some accounting, the year is a little bit longer than a year for fiscal purposes, but in the past year or so, we've shipped about 50 community health features. These are behind the scenes things. Hopefully you won't see them, that make it so those users that violate those user expectations it's harder for them to display that disruptive behavior. Things like preventing what we call drive-through PRs, where a user that has nothing to do with the project randomly opens up a pull request that disrupts your workflow and creates a lot of noise, or protecting namespaces so that people can't try to grab namespaces of popular repositories if a user deletes their account or renames their account. And then more excitingly, we also shipped about 50 new community management features. And that's what I'm going to spend the bulk of my talk talking about today in terms of tools that we give to maintainers so that they can enforce those community norms and those community expectations and grow safe, healthy, welcoming communities around their code. As we started exploring this space, it came up the concept of this, that there's really two stages of community maturity. When you first start out your project, you want the lowest barrier to entry possible, right? You put your project out there. You don't know if anyone's going to use it. You get your first issue. You're super excited. You want to make it as easy as possible to contribute because you want to maximize your potential contributors to kind of hit that critical mass and then take your project to the next level. At a certain point, once you achieve that critical mass, once kind of the signal to noise ratio flips, so do incentives. And you actually want to raise the barrier to entry. And so you shift from community growth to community management. This is where things like issue templates come in and having more stringent processes to contribute, right? This is where we start getting, from more sophisticated maintainers, requests for things like comment moderation queues or the ability to explicitly approve or disapprove users before they can post issues, right? So you want to increase the barrier to entry. And so I was originally wanted to spend about half the time talking about community growth tools, about half the time talking about community moderation tools. But listening to all the other great talks yesterday and today, I'm going to spend the majority of the time talking about community moderation and just briefly touch on community growth. If you haven't already, there was a really great talk yesterday on maturity models for community growth, a really great panel yesterday on community growth, and also a really great talk on community governance. It was hilarious. If you haven't seen them, check out the video. There were lots of donuts involved. I just got it. Portland, donuts, now it makes sense. There are a lot of donuts involved. It was a really great talk. So I'm going to focus on community moderation and just briefly touch on community growth. So when I talk about community growth, I like to say that you are the host of the internet's most boring dinner party. Or it could be a cocktail party, or maybe like a murder mystery party. You know, someone broke the bill, and you got to figure out who. There's one person in this room, something like that. But just if you're hosting an offline dinner party, right? You greet guests when they come in. You take their coat, maybe their umbrella if it's raining. You get them a seat at the table, and you introduce them to other guests. And if there is some sort of a conflict, if someone brings up politics or religion or something like that, it's your job as the host to step in and to steer the conversation back on track to get folks back to eating their dinner. And you can think about this through what my colleague Mike McClade calls the contributor funnel, or the phrase that I recently learned that I really liked is the reader to leader funnel, right? And that's kind of, for me, the typical story of open source, right? You download a project. You might even not even know that it's open source at the time that you download it. You start using it to solve a problem that you personally have. You find a bug or a feature, and you have a bug or a feature request. You Google it, land on GitHub, open up the repository, open that issue or pull request, yada, yada, yada. Like a year later, somehow you become the maintainer of the project, right? But the idea is just similar to a sales funnel. You want to get as many users as you can in the top of the funnel, and then lower the activation energy necessary to get them to the next level, to move users to contributors, and contributors to maintainers, and so your project can grow and your community can grow. And so 3 quick tips for how to do that. The first is to welcome and to recognize new contributors, right? When someone first submits their first issue or their first pull request, we have badges now on those users' comments that says first-time contributor. And the reason that's there is a subtle cue for maintainers to actually take that additional step and say, thank you very much for opening this issue, maybe provide a little bit of hand-holding in the process. And then once they do get that pull request merged, take the affirmative step to follow up and say, thank you very much for this pull request. Congratulations on getting your pull request merged. If it weren't for you, this project wouldn't even exist. And then take the opportunity to point them to other issues, right? In a little bit of a commitment escalation. They came here for this one issue. Here are 3 other issues that based on this that I think might now be good for you to tackle as well. And then also to recognize them, right? A lot of times people do open source. They like the warm fuzzy feeling of knowing that they made the project better. So in your release notes, in your user-facing documentation, have a credits page, have this feature was built by this person to really recognize and encourage that contribution. The second is to think through the developer experience, right? Just as in your own product, you think through the user experience of using your product, also think through the developer experience of contributing to your project, right? What does the documentation look like? What does the tooling look like? How long does it take to get a local development environment set up? Think through that experience and try to optimize not for your own processes wherever possible when you're in that growth stage, that growth mindset, but rather to optimize for the developer experience because they can just go to a different project. And last is to minimize friction. And when I say friction, it's in my mind, it's the time it takes to go from I want to do something to I have done something. So that could be, I found this one-line change, I know the fix. How long does it take not to actually write the code to make that change, but all the time it takes to figure out how to get my local dev environment, what tools I need, if I need to sign a CLA, if I need to wait 2 weeks for sign-off or something like that. What's the kind of the time to merge from the time the issue is open until the issue gets merged and gets closed. And so optimize those. If you're going to optimize for 3 things in community growth, that's where I would look. But like I said, just briefly touching on that, I want to spend the majority of the time talking about community moderation, because I think that's really interesting and really unique for how GitHub approaches it. So when we think about community moderation, I mentioned the concept of disruptive behavior, right? And so when a user exhibits disruptive behavior, it's up to the maintainer or to the platform to take what we call an intervention, to step in and do something to try to influence that behavior. You can do that before the disruptive behavior happens by encouraging good community behavior and establishing community norms. You can do it while the user is exhibiting that disruptive behavior by introducing friction into the process. So just as before, we were trying to minimize friction, you can actually do the exact opposite and try to maximize friction for a given interaction. And finally, after they exhibit the disruptive behavior, you can minimize the impact or the longevity of that disruptive behavior as well. And we think about all this through the concept of what we call tiered moderation. The idea being that for any given disruptive behavior that disrupts the workflow of the community, the maintainer has a tool in their toolbox to exhibit a proportionate response. And now you might be asking, what is the virtue of a proportionate response? Which if you're a West Wing fan at all, I'm from Washington, D.C., so I have to have a West Wing reference in the talk. If you're a West Wing fan at all, I thought that was from the West Wing. It's actually from the American president. Fun trivia I learned today. But what's the virtue of a proportionate response? And the idea is that studies show that there are not these concept of good users and bad users, but if you look at when the disruptive behavior happens, it often happens like 11:30 a.m. right before lunch when they're hungry, hangry being hungry and angry, or it happens late at night when they're tired and they're cranky. And so just because someone wasn't thinking straight, maybe they had a bad day at the office or they had a bad argument with their spouse or something like that, it shouldn't be, hey, you posted something off topic or your tone on that wasn't quite right and you're banned from the community forever. The idea is to give the opportunities, to give them a warning, to maybe give them a timeout, to let them know what they did and how they strayed from the community norm so that you can encourage them to get back into the community and start following community norms. So we want to provide the user the opportunity to self-rehabilitate their behavior and get it back in line with community norms. So how do you encourage good behavior? The first, of course, is to document community norms, right? Users can't follow the community norms unless they know what they are. These norms can be technical in terms of style guides, in terms of these are the tooling that we use, tabs versus spaces, something like that. But they can also be social, communicative, in terms of a code of conduct, or in terms of, we only communicate using emoji and animated GIFs. Whatever that might be, whatever your community norm is, there's, maybe not, you have the freedom within your community to set those norms and just got to make sure that you're communicating them with users. So about a year and a half ago or so, we introduced the concept of the community profile. So if you click on the Insights tab of your repository, whether you're a maintainer or just a user visiting the repository, you can see the community profile, which it tells you what of these community norms have you created and have you documented. And then if you haven't, for many of them, there's actually a templatic process you can go through, choose a standard, and just kind of start customizing it for your needs. So the community profile creates what we call community health files. Community health files are things like your README. What problem am I trying to solve? I like to think that the project's README is like the project's constitution and is one of the best and first tools that you have to moderate content within the repository because it's the ground truth. If in your README you have this is what the project is doing, we are trying to get to Mars or whatever it is, that's what the project is. Anything that doesn't advance that goal doesn't have a place within the project. And if the individual user disagrees with that, they can submit a pull request to get the README updated. Next is your contributing file, right? How can I help? This is not only the mechanics of, you must fill this issue template out, make sure to run tests locally, have separate commits, squash merge, but also you want to explicitly invite people to contribute. There are a lot of open source projects on GitHub that are just open source for the sake of being open source, or maybe the maintainer isn't as present and active anymore. So I make a note that the first line of every contributing file is thank you very much for contributing. We really want your contribution, and being really explicit about that expectation and that relationship. Third is the support file. This is relatively new, and a lot of large open source projects are adopting them. The point there is to disambiguate support resources versus technical issue tracking, right? So if I'm an end user and I have a problem, there's something I don't know how to do, but it might not necessarily be a bug, you might want to divert them into other forums where you'll have a better experience as a maintainer and the user will have a better experience as a user and get their question answered. So this could be a Slack channel, this could be a discourse channel, this could be Twitter, this could be Stack Overflow, anything like that. Code of conduct for how conflicts are resolved and an opportunity to further expand on those expectations, and of course, license files. So as I mentioned, we implemented the community profile about 1.5 years ago, and I was curious as I was preparing for this talk, and I wanted to see how the community profile changed adoption of those standards. And so looking specifically at code of conduct adoption for medium and large size repositories. So this is repositories with between 100 and 1,000 pull requests and repositories over 1,000 pull requests. You see that there's been quite an adoption of code of conduct in the past 2 years or so, with about 1 in 4 large communities, at least how I defined large communities, using codes of conduct. But the one kind of caveat here is to be purposeful about when you add process. So as you can see, there's generally a correlation between the size of the repository and the permutation of community health files. Here I use code of conduct and contributing files as an example, but it could be anything. And the reason I bring this up is so. For example, I recently pulled my old calculator programs off my TI-83 and posted them on GitHub and open sourced them. I don't expect that to be very popular. It's not the next Kubernetes or anything like that. So I just threw it up on GitHub, and I did not add a contributing file. I did not add a code of conduct. I thought that was over-engineering or premature optimization. And so it's not a hard and fast rule that when you open source a project, you don't need these things. If I were open sourcing something for GitHub, for example, even if I didn't expect that popularity just because of the maturity and the sophistication of the organization, I might include them from day one. But this is just to say, be purposeful about when you add process, and be purposeful about because that process comes with friction. And so just as there's that, you want growth in the beginning and management at the end, or not at the end, but towards the second half when you hit that inflection point, just be purposeful that you're not front loading that friction, because that will stifle your growth. So when you add those files, they get special treatment throughout the application, throughout the product, right? And so this is one of my favorite interventions. If you remember, it used to be every time you opened up an issue or a pull request, there was a giant yellow warning bar across the issue that was like, you must read these files. And we looked into the numbers, and spoiler alert, no one was reading those files because you just went blind to this giant yellow bar on every issue and pull request. So we went in and we create this idea of a tiered intervention, right? And so depending on your relationship to the repository, we get more and more in your face about reading those files. So here you can see a first-time contributor, someone who's never contributed to the project before, gets a giant box with a little waving smiley face or waving hand to be friendly about it and welcoming, pushing them to read the contributing guidelines and support instructions and code of conduct. That's dynamic based on what files you have in the repo. Then here's an example of a repeat contributor that wouldn't see anything unless the documentation has changed since they last visited the repo, and saying, hey, code of conduct has been updated, contributing guidelines have been updated, maybe you should take a look. I don't have it pictured here, but for maintainers, it's just little helpful links in the sidebar to get out of your way so you can do your work. And the idea is that even if you're a veteran in one repo and you're a maintainer of one repo, when you go to that other repo and start contributing, you want that in-your-face thing to be, oh, this is different, to encourage you to read the contributing guidelines. And we saw a huge increase in click-throughs as a result of that. The other thing I wanted to call out is help wanted and good first issue labels. If you're not familiar with these are specially named labels that GitHub provides fancy, uses in different contexts because we can understand the semantic meaning of those labels. And so here's an example. This is the React topic on GitHub. And you can see that we do a call out, and even as you're doing the search for projects, the listing of projects, right then and there, here's some good issues that you should take a look at and you might be interested in contributing to. This is for the top of that funnel, right? This is to get more users involved in your community, interested in your project, and get them contributing. And we also use this for things like Explore, for Discover, for the, hey, you should check out this project emails that new users get. And we weight these in the algorithm that decides which projects to promote. We also weight community health and inclusivity. So if you have a code of conduct, your mean time to respond to issues, average time for a pull request to get merged, all get weighted in that algorithm. So we're surfacing the healthiest, most welcoming projects and rewarding them by trying to get them more users that we think will contribute positively. The other feature recently in the same direction is we want you to be able to empower community members. So you got that user, the project was promoted to them, they were searching for React, they found your React project, they contributed, you're starting to trust them. So we recently rolled out new roles and permissions, specifically the triage role and the maintain role, to allow you to empower community members to take on additional responsibility and help with that community management task. So the triage role can do things like labeling issues and opening and closing issues and assigning issues and pull requests. And the maintain role can do non-destructive administrative tasks, such as changing the repo name or description, adding topics, and toggling some settings like enabling and disabling pages and stuff like that. And the last on this that I want to touch on is enforcing community norms automatically, or as I like to say, pedantic robots are better than pedantic humans. And so if you can use tools, one of my favorite is Probot, created by Brandon Keepers, that has a huge ecosystem of plugins to do all sorts of different things, to close out stale issues, where I've mentioned welcoming new users. You can set up a bot to welcome users and thank them for submitting pull requests. But as much as possible as you can automate this so that you can spend your time on more high value work, and then contributors get feedback faster, right? It's kind of like CI for community norms, that as soon as they do that thing that violates that community norm, a robot steps in and says, hey, maybe you should check out this. Here's a link to the documentation, so they can get that feedback. And you're not going to get angry at the robot. If I come to you and say, hey, like you use tabs and not spaces, it's a lot different than if a linter comes in and says that thing, and you generally have a better response to it. So that was, encouraging good behavior. The second intervention I talked about was during the disruptive behavior, introducing friction. So the first thing I want to talk about is locking conversations. The ability to lock a conversation has been on GitHub for as long as I can remember. It's one of our first community management tools. But we recently did some improvements to make that a better experience. The whole point of locking conversation is to provide a forced cooldown period to give participants time to cool off. It's the, hey, you two just go for a walk and we'll come back and talk about this. It can be temporary, of just, hey, we're going to lock this conversation for 24 hours. Let cooler minds prevail, and we'll come back and discuss this from a technical standpoint, or it can be permanent. A lot of times we see people using that when a decision has been made, it's a won't fix, but people keep chiming in, maybe not in a very constructive way. You just want to kind of end the conversation. And as you do that, you'll see it'll ask you for a reason why you're locking the conversation, and then that'll be displayed in the timeline as a timeline entry. So, Ben locked this conversation as too heated for 24 hours or whatever it might be. The next is, did my clicker die? That's sad. Okay. The next is to limit interactions. And so this feature rolled out a little bit over a year ago, and the idea is, again, to provide a forced cooldown period. It works best for disruptions that span multiple issues, or it can be activated on the organization level as well for disruptions, or we call them social incidents, that span multiple repositories. And by design, it can only be activated for 24 hours, because we wanted to make sure that you provided an opportunity for things to cool off, but you didn't permanently limit the opportunity for new users to get involved in your project or for new people to discover your project. So what the interaction limit does is it limits the ability for people to contribute to existing users, so accounts older than 24 hours, so people aren't creating sock puppet accounts to pile on in the discussion, to prior contributors, people that have previously submitted pull requests that got merged and have commits on master, or only to repository collaborators. So basically it becomes read-only to everyone except for the team. And I also want to talk on reporting comments. So recently we added the ability in the what we call the comment kebab menu, the little 3 dots in the top right corner of every comment. There's a report to GitHub button. And this is for things that you think might violate our terms of service or community guidelines, those first 2 things on the user expectations. And you might be wondering, like, hey, I have all these tools at my disposal. I can moderate the content myself. You just spent 20 minutes talking about how maintainers should moderate content. But the advantage here is we have the ability to moderate content site-wide, not just in your repository or in your organization. So if someone is being disruptive site-wide, if they're posting spam, if they're just generally being a jerk face or a bad actor across the platform, we can take action and get them off the platform or limit the visibility of their content site-wide. And so I try to dig into some stats around this. And the most interesting that I can find is that if repositories have a code of conduct, they're more likely to report comments. They're slightly more likely to report comments on average. And that's because the maintainers, in my theory, the maintainers are just more active, the community is more active, and they created a culture where community norms are enforced. And the last one I want to talk about this was blocking disruptive users. And we did a lot of changes here recently that I'm really excited to talk about. So we've had user blocking for a while. Not too long ago, we introduced the ability for organizations to block users. A blocked user can't interact with the repo at all. They can't post comments. They can't open issues. And this can be either a temporary block or a permanent block. So if that tiered moderation model, if you just want to give someone a timeout and say, hey, you're hot-headed, take 24 hours, take a week, then you can come back and we'll see if you can rejoin our community. And the other kind of variable that you as a maintainer have to play with is it can be silent, or you can actually give them a notification. So you see here the modal, if you try to block a user from a specific piece of content, by default, we're going to notify the user. We're going to say, hey, this organization just blocked you for this particular piece of content because it violated their code of conduct. And here's their code of conduct. The reasoning behind that is if we didn't do that, the user might not visit the repository that day. The whole point is that they should be notified that their conduct deviated from community norms and have the opportunity to see where they can get back into community norms. The other feature we added recently is you have the ability to then minimize all the comments as well. So if they're just being disruptive across a bunch of issues, you can automatically hide all their comments at the time that you block them. And so the last in this section I want to talk about was minimizing impact, right? So before the incident, you try to create the good community. That didn't work. During the incident, you try to limit interactions. Maybe that stemmed the problem or stopped the problem, but the damage is already done. Now you want to minimize the impact of that damage. So the first tool you have is the ability to hide comments. Again, that's from the comment kebab. A lot of the moderation tools are in there. And the idea behind this feature was to reduce the screen real estate of the disruptive content to increase the relative screen real estate of the good content, kind of increase the signal to noise ratio of the page. And so it's not completely hidden, it's just minimized. And any user that visits the page will see that the comment has been hidden, why it was hidden, and have the ability to opt in if they wanted to. It's kind of like the spoiler alert feature that you see on Reddit and other platforms as well. And again, looking at the numbers, on average, repositories that adopted a code of conduct were twice as likely to hide comments. Again, kind of supporting this hypothesis that there are communities that are serious about community moderation, are actively moderating content and actively pruning their community garden to make sure that conversations stay on track and productive. And the last of the tools is, and this is again has been around for a while, is the ability to edit or delete comments. This is if someone posts something offensive or something that is sensitive, like a password or a phone number or something like that, you as a maintainer can go in and can edit the comment, or the nuclear option, you can delete the comment. And if you do edit the comment and it is something sensitive, now that we have revision history, you can actually go through and purge revisions from the revision history as well to make sure that content is no longer available online. Underscoring all this is the concept that we want moderation to be transparent whenever possible, right? If you silently moderate content or silently block a user or something, it doesn't do any good. Moderating in the open, and in this case, you can see the desktop organization temporarily blocked a user, right? So moderating in the open like that breeds trust. It creates a sense of fairness, right? If you can see that the rules are being consistently applied and fairly applied all the time, then maybe when they're applied to you, you're less likely to react or to reach out. It also reinforces community norms, right? If I'm a third-party bystander and I'm looking at this issue, I saw user A did something and I saw that they got temporarily blocked. I know now that I shouldn't do that behavior that user A did. So it signifies both to potential disruptive actors and also to good actors, right? That the maintainer of the community is active, they're moderating content, and here's what you can and can't do. And my favorite part about this is if I'm also someone from a background that I might be more likely to be a victim of harassment or abuse, and I see this, I now can join the community with a little bit more confidence because I have a signal that the maintainer is there to have my back, that if something does go south, if there is some sort of interpersonal conflict, that the maintainer is going to step in and actually enforce the code of conduct, which might not always be the case across repositories. So what's next? I'm really excited. The next kind of iteration on this that we're doing is we're building out a new reporter, or a maintainer reporting experience. So right now, when you hit that report button, the only option is it goes to GitHub support, to our user policy team, to review to see if it violates our terms of service or community guidelines. In the near future, we're hoping to roll out the ability for maintainers to opt in to receive those reports themselves. So you as a maintainer could have a moderation queue, and if another user comes by and says, oh, this comment is offensive, this is off topic, you can get that report and you can see it as flagged, get a notification about it, and step in and moderate it immediately. And it will also be a better reporting experience for the users as well. So last time I was at OSCON, I did this nice tongue-in-cheek slide talking about what's next and what we want to do for GitHub. This was well before the Microsoft acquisition, and I had a little Clippy up there, which I learned their actual name is Clippit. And hey, hi there. Looks like you're trying to create an open source project. Do you want some help? The idea behind that was that we would do positive interventions at different points in the repository, in the project lifecycle, to encourage them to adopt community management best practices. And we started rolling that out. So one example of that is if you get your first pull request, so I published my TI-83 code, someone finds it and figures out a way to make my basic code better, and they submit that pull request, I'll get a little pop-up that says like, hey, congratulations on your first pull request. We got emoji there to make it a positive experience, but then pushes me at that point to start going over the community profile, to start building out the maturity of the community health files. Beyond that, what I'd really like to start doing is automated interventions. So something constantly in the back of our mind is maintainer burnout. Right? The more tools we give you, the more that we ask you to do. And as your community grows, that is a big, non-insignificant burden. And so we can do that in two ways, right? We can do, again, my joke, clip it, is as it's 3 a.m., I'm cranky, and I'm just responding to something really quickly. Maybe we slow that down. Maybe it fails the first time. Or maybe there is some sort of intervention that comes up, like, hey, we did some sentiment analysis on this, and maybe you should reword it or something like that. Not quite there yet. The thing that might be a little bit closer is we have this full suite of moderation tools and maintainer tools. If we can start activating those with your consent, but without you needing to click a button. So if there's a flame war in the middle of the night, if we can detect that and automatically lock the conversation or automatically give a user a timeout for 24 hours if they're posting too quickly or something like that, to take those tools that are currently at your disposal and try to use machine learning to automate them as much as possible. We're not there yet, but that's the direction that we're kind of trying to head, to offload some of that burden off of you so that you as a maintainer can focus on the code, on the project, on the fun stuff, and not have to be a full-time community manager. The majority of these tools and of these features all came as a result of user feedback. So if you have any feedback, if you have any ideas, if there's anything that, hey, I spend 2 hours a day doing this thing, if you can make this easier, it'd make my life so much better. That's me on Twitter and my email address. I would honestly love to hear from you, love your ideas. We want to make community management on GitHub just so natural and so easy so that you can grow communities around your projects, because that's why we got an open source. That's the fun thing. That's why we're all here, because of the community and because of the ability to solve shared problems together. So if you do have a moment, either during the Q&A or later, please take an opportunity to rate today's session. And to make it easier, if you go to bit.ly/rateBB, rate Ben Balter, you can go right to the page for today's session. And with that, I'll just say thank you and then open up the floor for questions, and I'll also be around afterwards, or feel free to tweet at me. If you can't tell, I'm glad to geek out about this kind of stuff all the time. So thank you very much.